Hi everyone, welcome to journey number 31. Today I have Furkhan Dandia on the show, and I haven't done an episode in a little while, so I'm excited to get back on it and really excited for this episode because I think Furkhan and I talk about a lot of similar things and have a lot of, just play in a similar realm. And so I'm interested to get his perspective, learn a little bit more about him. And to start off, Furkhan, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself, introduce yourself, and kind of what you're doing right now.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me, Jared. I appreciate it. My name is Furkhan Dandia. I'm currently based in Calgary, Alberta. During the day, I work as a oil and gas professional. And then in the evenings, I try to, jump into like coaching. I'm studying psychology part-time. So I'm really looking to help other men who kind of struggle with mental health. Uh, and the reason why I'm inspired is going through my own journey of divorce and struggling with mental health and isolation. And that's really inspired me to help other people who may be in similar situations or maybe struggling in different ways. So that's a little bit about myself. And then also part-time podcaster like yourself. So yeah, just trying to get the message out there, especially around men's mental health, and share other people's stories of adversity or how they've been able to overcome things and normalize those conversations that we typically have avoided or are afraid to have just because of shying from being vulnerable. So that's kind of my goal, is making vulnerability more common and making psychology cool.
I love it. And
Yeah.
vulnerability has been a big part of my journey as well. And you touched on it a little bit, but I'd love to go, deeper on, kind of what started your mental health journey. And you said, it kind of stemmed from, some of your own experiences going through a divorce. And me being from Calgary as well, I do know a little bit of that, corporate culture, especially oil and gas, where
Mm-hmm.
there isn't necessarily a lot of space for things
Mm-hmm.
like mental health, especially men's mental health, vulnerability. Can you go a little bit more into that of, specifically your journey and what pushed you in this direction, and as well to do it in public? Because I think there's a big difference between, going through this and working on yourself, privately,
Mm-hmm.
and going and actually putting a message out and, sharing it with others and, potentially trying to help others as well.
Yeah, 100%. I think, just going through the motions when I was separating and, people started hearing about what was going on in my personal life. And throughout my career until that point, my goal was to always keep my personal life separate from my professional life. And for me, I had all these aspirations of becoming a leader in the corporate world. And there was this image you had to maintain of kind of almost having everything together, having the perfect family life and all of that. And for me, it was really hard realizing that, hey, I wasn't one of those men anymore that kind of you looked up to in those corporate structures. And I don't know if it was more the organizational pressure I felt, or it was pressure I was putting on myself. I think it was a bit of both, but I really struggled in silence. I was going into work and pretending like everything was fine when it wasn't. And it was almost like living a split personality, which was really hard. It became really hard. And then when I came out of it, and obviously I was going for therapy throughout all of it, which really helped. But when I came out of it and kind of started looking back, I was like, wow, like that was incredibly hard. And just putting on a show, it didn't feel real. I wasn't being authentic with myself. I wasn't being authentic with other people. It was just, I wasn't able to look at, look at myself in the mirror and be happy with what I was seeing. So that's where it really came in, where I was, okay, well, how am I going to be vulnerable first? And then how can I demonstrate that for other people? So, the way I started looking at it is like, if I can normalize the fact that I'm going for therapy and I'm struggling and I need help and I want to talk about it, maybe someone else may feel empowered. And then, even if you can help one person, that could spread. So that's how I started looking at it. And recognizing that, there's probably, obviously, there's other men who are going through similar situations, whether it's a divorce or stress with job security, especially the way the oil and gas market has been over the last several years. There's a lot of pressure on people, men and women, to kind of maintain their employment, but there's stress that comes with it. So, whether it's divorce, job security, or anything that men may be struggling with, how can I help them? And it doesn't mean that they need to work with me, or it's just making it normal in terms of being able to have these conversations. And that's kind of the goal of my podcast too, is to have men come and share their stories, where if other people are listening, they can be like, oh, wow, okay, I'm not the only one. And that's really the goal, is to recognize that you are not alone, or you are not the only one. And for me, doing a full circle here, but when I was going through that whole struggle at work and separating, I felt like I was the only one. And that's why I needed to keep it private and hide that information. So it's really making sure that people recognize that you're not alone and you're not the only one going through it. And someone could relate if you really needed to help, ask for help or talk about it.
For sure. And, like there's a couple points in there that are super important. And that last one was huge in my life as well, where, a lot of the things that I struggled with, I felt like I was the only one that struggles with it.
Mm-hmm.
And it was kind of, like its own cycle. And for me, a huge thing, and it's something that I dug into a lot, was the idea of shame, and how much shame, I put on myself, and I shamed myself for my different struggles, my different, whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm.
And because I felt alone, because I felt like I was the only one struggling with this, it added more shame, which,
Mm-hmm.
then made me struggle even more, which then led to more shame. And I lived my life for a long time with that.
Mm-hmm.
And just going and realizing that a lot of these things are very common,
Yeah.
and you don't need that isolation. And I think it's such an important thing, and something that I try to do as well, is talk about these real subjects, these core things that not a lot of people talk about, to let everyone know that they're not alone in that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say the shame piece is absolutely important to recognize. And I carried a lot of shame. And again, looking back and trying to talk to other people, when you're on the outside, it's easier to see, but when you're actually dealing with it, I can understand how hard it is. So even when I'm talking to other friends or men that I know are struggling, it is easy for me to tell them, guys, like, just be vulnerable. Don't carry that shame. Don't carry this guilt of making certain choices. But until you don't internalize it, it is hard, right? And shame is huge, because we often, like, we've been programmed to be selfless, right? And then the second you do something where you're upsetting a whole bunch of people, even though internally that this is something that makes the most sense for you, you start carrying that shame. And that's what it was like for me. I was like, oh, I'm breaking my family apart. My parents aren't happy with it. Our common friends aren't happy. People at work are going to look at me differently. And it was like this whole concept of shame that I was putting on myself.
Yeah, and that's huge. There's so many, call them almost rules
Mm-hmm.
that that are put on us. And that was one that came to mind for me, as you touched on family.
Mm-hmm.
And feeling shame for needing to put up boundaries with my
Mm-hmm.
family, feeling shame for needing time away from them.
Mm-hmm.
You're always told, well, they're your family, well, that's
Mm-hmm.
your mom, well, that's your dad, well, that's your sister. So you essentially what people tell you to do is abandon yourself.
Mm-hmm.
You need to deploy self-abandonment and do it because it doesn't matter how it affects you negatively. You need to spend time with them, or you need to do this for them, or whatever it might be, because they're your family. And really taking it even to that extreme of like,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes you need space away from your family. Sometimes your family isn't healthy for you or your mental
Right.
health. And sometimes you need to do things for yourself that are going to upset those people.
Yeah, yeah. And you touched on something really important that I've kind of toyed with, and I kind of put it on one of my Instagram posts too, is the whole, by putting boundaries, you're also, you have this fear of abandonment from other people, right? So because of this fear of abandonment, you're abandoning yourself. And it's recognizing, okay, like which one, which one is the worst, right? And really putting thought into that.
For sure. And like for my story, it's essentially how I lived my whole life, was
Mm-hmm.
abandoning myself. And really kind of it came to a head when one day I asked myself the question, like, who would I actually be if I wasn't living for others? And I didn't have an answer. I had no idea who I actually was, because my entire life was, revolved around impressing others, or, getting them to like me, or, being the person that I thought they wanted me to be. And I had no idea
Mm-hmm.
who my true self was.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the people pleasing aspect that comes in. And one of the things I try to do, or when I'm working with men, is identifying what the source of that is, right? And for me, I'm a huge supporter of childhood trauma, and I believe that a lot of ours, like the source of our issues, come from childhood, right? And we've all experienced some form of trauma, and I know people kind of cringe at the word trauma, but I mean, even the smallest thing can be traumatic for us if it was in our childhood, right? And it's all subjective. Your experience might be different than mine, and one may not be worse than the other, but it all comes from there, right? And even people pleasing behavior, it's something that we inherit from childhood, and we carry it on into our adult life, and it comes into our romantic relationships or relationships with friends and family, even at work. So it's good that you've recognized that, and unfortunately a lot of people don't, and then they keep repeating the same behaviors and patterns, and they keep wondering why things don't change.
Yeah, it's huge. And it's, what I spent and have spent the majority of my time in therapy digging into is
Mm-hmm.
my childhood, the different experiences, the decisions I made about myself as a 12-year-old boy that, I took as truths, but, I forgot that those were decisions.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah. And it's incredible to me, the effects that, things can have, and that we push them down so deeply. And if you don't actually go looking for them, if you don't actually go and dig into them and deal with them, they just show up, like you said, they show up again and again and again. And
Yeah.
you keep making the same mistake. It's, it seems like the same stories playing over and over and over again. Because the way that I think of it is, you don't address the root, right? You don't address the root of the problem. There's lots of branches that come off that, they'll
Mm-hmm.
manifest themselves, just like you said, in romantic relationships, professionally, whatever it might be. There's so many of them in different ways that they show up. But if you never address that root, new branches are going to grow, right? And
Mm-hmm.
they're going to keep coming back. Doesn't matter how much you snip them.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it's also recognizing that, what I try to tell people is, like, don't be so hard on yourself. Like, sometimes you need to go through that journey of keep having those learning moments in life. And at some point, and I was kind of in that situation where I was like, okay, this is enough, right? Like, what am I doing here? And what do I need to change? And until you don't get to that point, you don't really dig deep and find that root, as you said. And sometimes people are just afraid to go there because of the answers they may get, or it's just they've tucked it away so far that they just don't want to, you know, kind of open it up and have to face some of those hard truths, from whether it was from childhood, or or later on in life, we are programmed that way. Our brains function that way, where brain's purpose is to protect us. So we tuck away these issues, and a lot of people are afraid to go there. And it's unfortunate, but it's reality too, right?
For sure, and that's one of the things I tell people all the time is, working on yourself, digging into those, real things, those root issues. It's fucking tough. It's
Mm-hmm.
not easy. It's,
No.
some of the hardest work that I've ever done in my life, and it's slow. It's
Yeah.
slow, it's painful, it's difficult. And, I think that's why a lot of people stay away from it. But,
Mm-hmm.
I always tell them what becomes of it is truly life changing.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, it's painful going through them and actually working through them, but it eliminates so much of the pain that you carry in your everyday life. And I'm curious, going back a little bit to your story of
Mm-hmm.
um you know for me, as I've done a lot of reflecting over the last couple of weeks, I realized how much of my life I lived in extreme pain and carrying pain with me. And what I would do is shove it down. I don't
Mm-hmm.
have to deal with that. I'm going to turn off all of my emotions. And, I would engage in numbing out activities. I would, do anything that I needed
Mm-hmm.
to try to make myself feel good, or, just hide that pain. And I didn't even realize that that's what I was doing. I didn't realize that, the true feelings that I was feeling that were in my gut. Um, I didn't realize just how intense they were and how long I carried them with
Mm-hmm.
myself.
Mm-hmm.
And, so I'm curious, in your story, I know that the separation kind of kicked that off, but when you were reflecting, do you think that you were struggling with a lot of the things that you went into before that and weren't aware of it? Or, you know, was that kind of the catalyst that just allowed you to do more self-discovery that led to working through some of those past experiences?
Um, yeah, it's fairly complex, but I think it came to a point where, in the initial stages of separation, it was like a wave, up and down. But there was moments where I'd play the victim in my mind. I'm like, oh, why is this happening to me? Like, I've done nothing wrong, and and you know, I remember like having those moments of being the victim, and at one point realizing that, okay, well, I have a role in this, like probably a huge role, and I could sit here and blame others and just keep moving on with my life, or I can take this opportunity to understand what role did I play. And that's where it really forced me to dig deep and understand what were the things I was doing. And when I said it's complex, it's, with romantic relationships, I was kind of manifesting the same patterns because of my childhood experiences of seeking approval. So I was putting myself in these relationships where I was constantly creating the belief, or I guess the main theme was I wasn't good enough. So I would keep doing things over and over to get that approval from my partner, and then it just became this dance between me and my partner where I would get criticized, so I would like bend over backwards to get their approval, and it was recognizing where that came from. And so that was one part of it, and then the other part was just I had, again, from childhood, taken on this caretaker role, and because of that I had abandoned myself. And the way that would manifest is I would get angry, but it wasn't like I was, and then until I didn't do the work, I didn't realize that I was angry with myself for abandoning my own feelings and what I wanted, because I was always worried about caretaking. So again, going through therapy and really digging deep, and recalling some very hard situations from my childhood, I didn't recognize that, this is what the pattern has been my entire life. And then coming to the realization that, I did what I had to do as a child to protect myself, and it's no one's fault. And having grace and compassion for that child, and forgiving my parents, and that was a process in itself. But it was so liberating when you even having those conversations with my parents, being like, hey, this happened, and I forgive you guys. I know it wasn't your fault. And also telling myself that at the end of the day, whatever happened. Like, yes, it was nobody's fault, but it is my responsibility now as an adult to deal with it and make the changes so I don't keep repeating the same behaviors or patterns.
For sure. And that's extremely powerful. And, it's something that I've been going through as well, is looking at my parents as human beings instead of my parents, and,
Yeah.
taking away and trying to really internalize the fact and forgiving them, and not blaming them, and acknowledging that some of the things that happened caused me to do this, or to think like this, or cause these issues later on in life. And like you were talking about at the beginning, one thing that I've really grabbed onto is that idea of almost extreme ownership. Even if it's not quote unquote my fault, I can still take ownership over it. I can take the power back over that, instead of it. This is something that happened to me, is taking responsibility, taking, how could I have shown up differently, or how can I show up differently now? And, I think it's something that not a lot of people want to do, is,
Yeah.
Say, I'm taking ownership for how I showed up.
Yeah.
And have you run into that? And in those cases, what do you say to those people where they say, well, that's not my fault? All right. That's, that was
Yeah.
the other person.
I mean, yeah. I mean, when people say that, I agree with them. I say, yeah, it is not your fault, but at the end of the day, it's your responsibility, right? Like, and it's the same thing when, someone, like, even if you're driving and someone cuts you off or flips you the finger, like, yeah, it's not your fault that they're being difficult or whatever, but it is your choice on how you react.
Yeah.
Right. So if you're going to react and do the exact same thing, you're no different than them. So you can't be mad at them because now you've done the exact same thing.
Yeah.
Or you could choose to let it go, and that's completely in your control, right? So I remember going through that when I was getting therapy and really trying to figure things out. I think one of the things that resonated with me the most was hearing David Goggins' story, and he talked about how abusive his dad was when he was a child, and almost recognizing at one point where he said, yeah, his dad did terrible things or whatever, but at the end of the day, who he chooses to be as an adult is his responsibility. And you can sit there and you can blame and you can pass on the buck, but it's your life, right? And these people, even our parents, yeah, they did the best they could, but at the point we are in our lives, they're not there to hold our hands, or even if we keep blaming them, there's nothing they can do for you to live your life differently. So, and to your point, you could take that power back, right? Like at the end of the day, by taking ownership and really choosing how you want to live your life, the power is back in your hands. And some people I find are more comfortable staying in that comfort zone, right? Like the familiar.
Yeah.
And by passing the power on to other people, they don't have to put themselves in the spotlight, and it's easier, it's comfortable, and that's where we don't grow. We don't grow in the comfort zone, and that's what I try to tell people.
Yeah. Yeah. No, so true. And switching gears a little bit, but it's
Mm-hmm.
something that you've brought up a couple of times, is the fact that you went to therapy. And
Mm-hmm.
I opened up about that as well. And it was something that I held a lot of shame around when I first
Mm-hmm.
started going. And it was very interesting because I have a history of treating other people very differently than I treat myself.
Mm-hmm.
And so other people would go, they would tell me that they're going to therapy. I would feel amazing for them. That's so good. Like sometimes I would, encourage them to go. But for myself, when the idea of going to therapy came up, so much shame. It was like, well, that's great
Hmm.
for other people, but I don't need this.
Yeah.
And, finally got to the point where it's just like, I can't work on some of these things by myself. I've
Hmm.
tried and nothing has changed. And it's kind of that idea of like the same things kept happening over and over and over again. And I knew that they were. And so I needed help.
Hmm.
And still, for the first, I think, year or year and a half that I went to therapy, I told nobody. I
Hmm.
didn't, my sister is the person that is closest to me in my entire life. And I wouldn't tell her, even
Hmm.
though she's gone to therapy. And, you know, um, I know that, she'll accept me no matter who I am or what I do. I still couldn't tell her. And
Hmm.
so I just, I'd love to hear a little bit about your journey of, going to therapy. And then two, one thing that I get asked a lot is people are curious about it. And they said, well, how did you find your therapist or how did you go about that? So if you could hit on
Hmm.
both of those, that'd be amazing.
For sure. Yeah. And I just want to say, like, I still go, not as frequently as I did when I needed to, but yeah, I'll touch on that for sure. I mean, very similar. I remember the first time I went was for marriage counseling, and for me, and it's all about mindset, so I'll touch on that too. But initially, I thought therapy was basically admitting that something's wrong with you. It's like, oh, you've accepted defeat, especially with marriage counseling. It was like, okay, you've accepted defeat, and you're like, okay, we can't figure this out. Now we need help. And the word help meant like you couldn't do it. And my entire life, um, I've been a high achiever, and I've never, until that point, I'd never sought help on anything. It was like, oh, I can do it myself. And that's the way my mom programmed me, right? It's like you never depend on anyone, so I remember going for that first appointment. I was just like, oh, this is brutal. I can't believe I'm here. And after a while, it started becoming normal. Like, my ex and I, we were going for marriage counseling, and it was great. Like, once you start going, you realize, okay, there's another perspective here that I'm not seeing. So now you're in a room where there's three different perspectives, and it makes you realize that, okay, well, my way is, maybe there's some truth to how I see things, but there's other truths in there. And it's really getting to that point where you start having your ego starts taking a back seat, and you realize that, for me, it was all about being humbled, right? Recognizing that, okay, I see things a certain way, but it doesn't mean it's right. And then when going through the separation, I completely relied on therapy, and that in itself was a journey. It kind of followed different directions. Initially, I just needed someone who would just listen to me. Uh, and then it came to a point where after I was done venting, I needed a therapist who would challenge me and stuff, because I was doing a lot of self reading and learning about myself, where I needed someone who can challenge me on things and plant the seed, right? So I went through. So this is like the second part of your question. I started uh, looking up different therapists, and I probably went through, in a span of 2 years, maybe six different therapists, and until, like, I would say maybe 3 years ago, I didn't find, like, I found one where I was like, okay, this person gets me now. And at the end of the day, therapy, you also need to, it's a relationship between you and your therapist. And if you don't feel comfortable, or if you feel like they're not uh, adding value in your sessions, then it's okay to change therapists. You're not, there's no way, or you're obligated to them. And now that I'm studying the counseling program, I recognize that, therapists are trained for that. You need to be able to identify whether or not you're adding value for your client. So there's nothing like personal, right? If your client shows up one day and they're like, hey, you know what, this isn't working for me anymore, I'm probably going to go try someone else. either you can recommend someone or you wish them the best, right? So there's no obligation if you're a client that you need to stick with the same therapist. And that's what I try to tell people, that maybe you need someone at a different point, and then as you evolve, you can feel free to change therapists. And like I said, I went through 5 or 6 until I found one that, okay, now I go once a month, once every 2 months, whenever I feel like there's certain things I need to work through. Or if I'm getting triggered about something new that came up, I'll go work through that with my therapist. And the way I try to normalize it for people with therapy is because, like yourself, I carried a lot of shame initially, but I talk about it openly now. It's like the analogy I use is, it's like your car, right? If you don't take it in for servicing every 3-4 months, it's going to break down. And that's what you need to think about, even with your mental health. If you're not going to go in and do the checks, or just get that, or do the check-in with your therapist, things are going to start adding up, and then you're going to have to work through a lot more had you been a bit more proactive.
For sure. Yeah, I love that one. I haven't heard that one before, so I'm going to add that to the repertoire. Like for me, the one that I really grabbed onto was the personal trainer
Mm,
comparison, right? Of, you don't look at somebody at the gym who has a personal trainer and you're like, oh, look at them, they need help, right?
mhm,
Like, they've failed, they need help with their, physical health. Is no, it's, it's a professional that helps you out, that elevates it, that is trained, that knows more than you. And that's the one that I've really grabbed onto. And it was so important what you were saying, is it's a relationship as well, and you need
mhm,
different people at different times. And that's one of my biggest pieces of advice to people, is make sure, just because they're a therapist doesn't mean that they're right for you.
mhm,
And go and talk to them and see if how it feels, see if it they understand you, if they seem like they can give you what you need, and if you feel safe in that environment, because sometimes you don't with
mhm.
certain people.
Absolutely.
And another really interesting part of it is, even if you take, it's included in there, but therapeutic relationships can be with a therapist, they can also be friendships.
Mhm,
And what happened and has been happening a lot in my romantic relationships is, I have had to be very conscious about not having my romantic relationships turn into therapeutic relationships. And
yeah.
it's something that I've worked, and I still haven't figured out completely. Um, but one of the things that my therapist tells me, she goes, in therapeutic relationships, one person will always outgrow the other, right?
Mhm,
And that's true with, again, therapists, with friendships, with romantic relationships. If they were based on that therapeutic side of things, if that is the base of the relationship, eventually you'll outgrow your therapist.
yeah.
And so setting up romantic relationships in that way sets them up for failure eventually.
Mhm.
And I don't
Yeah,
know.
no.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, yeah, it's you need to be able to create that distinction for sure. And that's where, you know, for me it resonates when I say, I've taken on that caretaker role, right? You cannot rescue someone. And people talk about taking on projects and stuff, like you need to be in romantic relationships. The way I look at it is, like, you need to be two independent entities that come together, right? And you kind of do your own. I mean, you grow together, but you also do your own, go on, have your independent journey of growth. And that's where, if one person is either doing self-learning or whatever, or if they need to go for therapy, that's all independent. And again, you can be honest with each other on what your growth is based on, but you cannot rely on each other for that help, as you mentioned.
Yeah, no, it's such a, there's so many intricacies, and especially with romantic relationships, there's so many layers to them. And
Mhm.
it's one that I definitely haven't figured out, but I'm working towards in different ways now.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. I do want to mention one thing about therapy, and for people that are still kind of, again, if there's a stigma around it, the only other thing I'll mention is therapists are human too. They're not experts. Yes, they have knowledge that they can help you with, but at the end of the day, they're also human. So that's the thing you need to keep in your mind when you do go for therapy, is like, they're not going to fix you right away. They're going to help you and guide you. But at the end of the day, you know, you're an equal participant as much as they are. And then if, you know, again, if you feel like you're not getting enough value out of it, yeah, go for find another therapist, but don't go in thinking that, oh, this person is just going to like fix me. And you know, if you're really digging deep and you're uncovering a lot of childhood stuff, or even dealing with something that may have happened recently, recognize that one session is not going to fix it. And that's where I think a lot of people get caught up, is like, they'll go for one session, they're like, well, that didn't work. And it's like, well, either the therapist wasn't great for you, or this is a deep layered issue that you need to spend a lot of time. And I remember when I was going through some of my childhood stuff, it took me a good 2 months of going once a week and really digging deep. So, you know, understand that it is also a commitment.
For sure. And I'm so glad that you brought this up, because to your point, one of the things I've come to realize, and I tell people a lot as well, is at the end of the day, if you are not willing and ready to change, it doesn't matter,
Mm-hmm.
you know, where you go, what kind of work you do, what kind of book you read. If you aren't willing to truly change and put that work in, yes, you can improve, you can make, you know, minor changes, you can,
Mm-hmm.
things can be a little bit better. But there's no magic bullet. There's no, you know, do these 4 steps and it'll magically be okay.
Yeah.
Or, you know, go for one session and everything will be fixed.
Yeah.
And I think an interesting one that has come up very recently in conversations that I've had is explaining that to people who are trying to support those around them,
Mm-hmm.
who have a friend that's struggling, or their partner, or whatever it might be. And, you know, just reminding them that if that person is not actually willing to do the work, if that person is not willing to change, it doesn't
Mm-hmm.
matter what you do. It doesn't matter how much effort you put in. It doesn't matter how much time you spend. Things aren't going to change.
Yeah. 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 And that's the other, I mean, I use another, I'm full of analogies, but sports analogy I use is, you know, like, if you're a professional athlete, you know, your coach is going to sit with you and go over the game plan. And you can sit there and practice the game plan with the coach all you want. But until you don't go, like, if you're a hockey player, until you don't execute on the ice, like, there's nothing to show for it. Right. And that's ultimately what happens, is like, you know, you with your therapist too, it's, or your partners, you know, you can talk about all the things you're going to work on, but then you also have to go execute it on your own. Um, you know, no one's going to be there holding your hand. So it's recognizing that, yeah, there's a lot of things you can learn about yourself, but you need to go do it.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. You know, switching it up a little bit is, I was watching one of your videos and it really struck home for me. And you talked about, you know, negative beliefs about yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them being, you know, I'm not worthy of love.
Mm-hmm.
And that is something that I struggled with most of my life, which I didn't know. I didn't
Mm-hmm.
realize that, you know, that's kind of what drove me. And that's why I was seeking so much approval. That's why I needed to be, you know, quote unquote, perfect. And
Mm-hmm.
perfectionism kind of ran my life. And again, you know, like I mentioned earlier, of becoming the person that I thought that person wanted me to be.
Mm-hmm.
And as you know, through several years of going through a lot of these things, and again, taking back to my childhood and, you know, peeling back all the different layers, realizing for myself just how low of a view I had on myself, how low my self-worth was.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm curious, you know, how you started to tackle that, of feeling like you're worthy, you know, like trying to combat that negative view of yourself of I'm not worthy of love. What were some of the steps that you took, or what was your journey around that?
Yeah, I mean, it's still a journey I'm on. uh, you know, I think, yeah, people need to recognize that, you know, you've been a certain person for 15, 20, 25 years. So you're programmed a certain way, and it's really hard to rewire, right? Despite me recognizing, the patterns I've carried in relationships, it's still a lot of work to rewire myself. And it takes a lot of time and effort. And I guess for me, it was recognizing to your, very similar to you, bending over backwards or trying to get that approval, and almost not being yourself. And when you're not being yourself, are you really happy deep down inside? You're not, because you don't, yeah, you're just trying to be someone else to get someone's approval. And then when you get that approval, it's empty because you're constantly chasing something that is not achievable. So I think, one of the things I tell people, especially when you're going into relationships, is being very honest up front. And that's probably the hardest part, because you meet someone new and things are amazing. You're in this honeymoon phase. You don't want to rock the boat. You don't want to have these difficult conversations because you're worried that you're going to scare them away. And then you kind of fall into this pattern now, and you've set the standard of what person you're going to be and what person they're going to be. And then it becomes a lot more difficult to bring about change in the relationship dynamics. So as hard as it is, I think if the other person is willing to have this conversation with you, then that in itself is a sign that this person has done their work, they're confident, and they're willing to build a good foundation with you. But it's being very firm on your boundaries and saying, okay, this is who I am. These are the things that I am willing to negotiate on and work with. And these are my hard no's. And if that person can't accept it, then they're not the right person for you. But you cannot change yourself to make it, to accept something that you're just not comfortable with. And that's where people get lost, because then they start compromising on their boundaries. And that's, then you start falling into this well that you're just trying to crawl out of, because now you've set the standard. Now, all of a sudden, say 6 months into the relationship, you're like, you know what? I cannot accept this, or this doesn't work for me. And the other person's like, well, why is this coming up now?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think when you, your self-worth is something you are going to define. That's why it's self-worth. And if you're not setting boundaries around how you want to be treated, if you're not leading by example and showing, like, role modeling for the other person of how you want to be treated, how can you expect them to know different? They're not going to read your mind. And that's the key, right? You need to lead by example. So if you're going to have porous boundaries, then the other person's going to keep pushing them, because that's all you've modeled for them.
Yeah.
And then you can sit there and get mad at them, but the person you really need to focus on is yourself. So I know this is like easier said than done, because if it was easy, I would obviously not be struggling myself. So, but those are the things you need to focus on. And I think those are things you need to identify from the onset of the relationship. And if you scare the other person away, then that's not your fault. It's not your fault that the other person got scared away because you were being honest. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
no, it's huge, and it touches on so many different things that are important, and having those non-negotiables for yourself, and something that I'm still trying to determine, because it was, for most of my life, I lived from, and I came from that place of, I need this acceptance. I will, gain this acceptance at any cost. And so, taking a step back and looking at it, what are my non-negotiables? What are my, if this happens, or like, this is specifically what I'm looking for. And if it's not there, then this relationship isn't for me, which scares the shit out of me.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I think a part of it, and myself included, is that fear of being alone.
Yeah.
Right. So you're like, oh, if this person leaves me, then I'm going to be alone.
Yeah.
And, again, it's easier to say this, but would you rather be unhappy and compromise everything you value over being alone? I don't know. I mean, it, there is something like when you're alone, like for me, for example, I've made a list of my non-negotiables now. And it's like, okay, you kind of make a list of the things you want in a relationship and the things you don't want. And then you kind of like have that conversation with yourself too. It's like, which ones am I willing to budge on? And which ones are like the absolutely like non-negotiable, like I'm not going to budge on. And it's understanding that. And yeah, you could say, oh, now you're like creating, like you're getting picky and you're creating like, if you've got a pool size of 10 women, now you've just basically limited yourself to two. I could see that argument too, but at the end of the day, like you you have to be authentic with yourself. Otherwise, you're not doing any justice to your partner or yourself if you're just compromising it on things that you believe in.
Yeah. And, I think it's a lot of old programming and old messaging.
Yeah.
And, it's something that I identified coming from my parents
Mm-hmm.
of very both conscious and unconscious messaging to me my entire life of you make do,
Mm-hmm.
right? Things aren't going to be great.
Mm-hmm.
They'll only be okay. And that's what you strive for. It's impossible to be happy. You'll
Mm-hmm.
settle with your partner, you'll settle with your job. Work will always turn into work and you'll hate it.
Mm-hmm.
And having to say no to that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And going back to what you were saying before of, well, yes, you might have narrowed down that pool a little bit, but isn't it better to explore things with those two women that meet, what you're looking for, as opposed to, going into a relationship that you're just okay with, or you're not actually happy about. And I feel
Mm-hmm.
like that's where a lot of these problems come down the road, right? You hear
Mm-hmm.
about a lot of midlife crises or whatever it might be. And, in my opinion, I think a lot of it comes from not dealing with those issues at the beginning and telling yourself things will change, or telling yourself that, either you're being ridiculous or you shouldn't do that, whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm.
And, touching on boundaries, like you brought up, a really interesting shift in perspective was, I don't remember where I heard it, but, really internalizing the ideas that people's response to your boundary are their response and are not a reflection on you.
Yes.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
that really switched things up in my mind and in my thinking.
Yeah. I mean, like, again, it's like, you've got a door for your home, and if someone gets mad at like the door being locked, that's not your problem. You're protecting yourself. You have certain like rules, and if someone can't accept that, that's on them. That's not on you. And that doesn't mean you like all of a sudden open your door up and let people come in just because you're worried about approval, right? And it takes a lot of work and shifting your mindset. And and same as you, like those things were modeled for me by my parents, that you just compromise. And yeah, there's certain things you can, but other things that are your non-negotiables you can't.
Yeah.
And then the other thing I want to mention, which is I think really important, that people, I don't know if a lot of people think of it this way, but at the end of the day, it's not your partner's responsibility to make you happy.
Yes.
So happiness is something you need to find within yourself. And if you and your partner can both find it within yourselves, you're coming together. But your happiness is not dependent on someone else. It's not someone else's responsibility to make you happy. And if you're not happy with who you are, they can try all they want. It's just they'll never get there. So recognize that you show up to a relationship whole, complete, someone that loves themselves and are happy and content with themselves. And then the other person shows up, and together you can grow. But it's not my job to make someone happy, and it's not theirs to make me happy.
huge point, and something that I had to do a lot of work around as well. And that idea that, I'll find somebody that completes me, or
Hmm.
I'll find, that kindred spirit that, like, complements every single thing about me, that there's the perfect person out there, that there's one person that will solve all of my problems. And one of my favorite quotes is, relationships aren't 50-50, they're 100-100. And that
Hmm.
speaks exactly to your point of, it has to be two full individuals entering into a partnership. Because if you're looking for that other person to fill you up, or to, make you happy, or complete you, whatever it might be,
Hmm.
you're going to be set up for failure, because
Yeah.
you have to do that work on your own. Both people do.
Yeah, for sure. And I see it a lot where, again, that fear of being alone that I talked about earlier, you see a lot of people just jumping from one relationship to the other. And then, things go sideways and they're like, oh, okay, well, this person wasn't right. And it's like, how many people do you actually see that spend that time alone for a while? And there's no set timelines, but really alone for a while, understanding themselves. Like, if you don't understand yourself, what your boundaries are, what makes you happy, what you want in life, how can you expect to go into a relationship and understand that about someone else?
Yeah,
So, like, spend that time really getting to know yourself and understanding your triggers and what the source of those triggers are and where did they come from, and healing yourself and really knowing what are the things you want in life and what makes you happy, and find that happiness within yourself. Like, love yourself first before you can go love another person. And it's important, and I know a lot of people struggle with that. And the tendency is to jump from a relationship to another. And I mean, this is, we could talk about this for hours, but with the world we live in currently, with online dating and everything, it doesn't make it easy because it's right at our fingertips. But spend that time really knowing yourself, so then you can, what you want in a relationship.
for sure. And, I think another important point is to realize that, as we talk about knowing yourself and, stepping in as a complete, individual, there is, I think, a key point as well of, there is not a finish line. There's not
Hmm.
a specific point that you get to that you're like, okay, now I'm ready,
Yeah.
right? Or now I'm done, I would say. Because there is, yes, I'm ready for a relationship. There's not, I've done enough work. I've
Yeah.
completed myself, so now I can go into a relationship. Because the story I told myself was just that for a very long time. It was, as I started digging into this stuff, as I started doing the work, of course, at the beginning, I needed that time to be alone. I needed that time to work on myself, to understand myself. And as it went on, I used it as an excuse. Oh, I'm not
Hmm.
ready yet. I'm not ready yet. Like, I need to be complete. I need to be finished. I need to be,
Hmm.
you know, the done before I step into a relationship. Stepping in as a full individual, as 100% you, and understanding yourself does not mean that you're done the work. It doesn't mean
Hmm.
that you figured everything out. It means that
Hmm.
you, at least to me, it means
Yeah.
that, you have some self-awareness, you understand yourself, and you don't need that person. That
Hmm.
person can elevate you, that person can help you, that person can walk beside you on that journey,
Hmm.
but that person can't take the journey for you. That
Yeah. No,
person, yeah,
I agree 100%. And that's what I try to remind myself, but also tell other people, is this journey is never ending, right? And I think the biggest humbling moment came for me when I was in therapy, and I dealt with all these childhood issues, and I was like, oh wow, I've done so much and I feel so much better, and I think I finally figured it out. And then I remember, like, a few months later, something else triggered me. And for me, that was recognizing that, there's gonna be, I'm gonna heal something from the past, but something new is gonna come up and it's gonna trigger me. And that's how life is. You're gonna continue on this journey of growth, and it's gonna be a never-ending life experience of learning. And yeah, you can't tell yourself that, hey, I'm gonna be this complete person and go into a relationship. And the way dynamics work is, there's going to be sometimes your partner is going to trigger you in different ways that you didn't even know existed.
Yeah.
And that's when you need to be vulnerable and honest with yourself and your partner, saying, hey, this is what came up for me in this situation. And I want to work through this, right? But yeah, it's like agreeing with everything you said about wanting to be whole and then going into a relationship, because that's never going to happen.
Yeah. We are running out of time here. So before we kind of wrap, I was curious if there was anything we didn't get to that you wanted to talk about. Yeah, just anything that's on your mind.
No, I think we touched on many things, so this was great. So yeah, nothing else to add at this point.
Awesome. And then if people are curious and people want to follow you or connect with you, what would be the best places for them to do that?
Yeah, so I think the best is my Instagram. So my Instagram account is at Unoiazen. So it's spelled EUNOIAZEN. And then my website is unoiazen.com. So either or works, but yeah, that's kind of the best way to find me.
Perfect. And I'll put that in the notes as well. But
Yeah.
Before I let you go, I just wanted to say, I appreciate the vulnerability. It's so important, putting your story out there, talking about some of these subjects that not a lot of people talk about, especially as men, but in general as well. And, offering a safe space and letting those people know that they're not alone. So I wanted to thank you for that. And the last question that I ask everybody who comes on here is, what does the next phase in your journey look like? And you can kind of take that any way you want, professionally, personally, whatever comes to mind.
The next phase, I guess it's hard to say, but for me, it's still continuing on this journey of growth. I'm still discovering more and more about myself. And I think the biggest piece I try to remind people is stay humble, right? Don't forget where you were. Because like for me, I remember facing adversity and how hard it was. And I know that I could also be back in that position again. So it's just being humble and continuing to learn and not tell myself that I figured it all out.
Amazing. Love that.
Yeah. And I want to thank you, Jared. Thanks for having me on, and thank you for being vulnerable as well. It obviously, if there's no shared space, then it's hard to have these conversations. So thank you as well.
I appreciate you saying that. You're welcome. And I can't wait to connect soon because
yeah,
I think we still have a lot to talk about. So
yeah, we do for sure.